Welcome to One Bite is Everything, the podcast that is dedicated to uncovering some of the unknown truths about your food. Today, we go back in time to look at agriculture's underpinnings, where we uncover some history about the origins of our agricultural economy in the United States. I am your host, DiPrima, and today we have a fascinating discussion that dives deep into the history and current realities of rural life in America. Our guest is Professor Megan Birk, a historian and author who teaches at the University of Texas at Rio Grande, where she specializes in rural and agricultural history. Megan will lead us on an exploration of the long-standing tensions between urban and rural communities, the diverse experiences within rural life, and the evolving challenges and misconceptions faced by those who live and work in these areas. From the romanticized images of family farms to the harsh realities of modern agricultural practices, Megan's insights will shed light on the complexities and resilience of rural communities. To give you a little bit of perspective, let's look at the numbers. Today, only about 19% of the U.S. population lives in rural areas. This is a significant decline from the early 20th century when nearly half of all Americans lived rurally. This shift has been driven by urbanization and the migration of people toward cities for more diverse economic opportunities. This decline in rural population has brought several key issues to the forefront, like limited access to healthcare, education, particularly funding limitations that lead to fewer opportunities, economic opportunities and employment options, especially as small family farms have continued to disappear. Other issues include infrastructure limitations like access to the internet and an undercurrent of mental health issues that are exacerbated by a combination of economic stresses, isolation, and limited access to mental health services. Understanding these dynamics is crucial as we dive into the stories of those who live and work in rural America, like our farmers. Their experiences and challenges are integral to the broader narrative of our food system and community vibrancy.
This is not a new tension, it's an old tension. The sort of misunderstandings that come from having different types of lives, from relying on different types of resources. As soon as the United States started to urbanize a little bit, those tensions became pretty apparent that although these regions need each other, there's some symbiosis there that takes place, but people are living much different types of lives. And so that tension has existed a long time, and lots of different people and policymakers have taken some swings at trying to figure out how urbanites can help improve life for rural people, and rural people have tried to explain, the stewardship with which they care for the land and resources and the food and things that they provide. And so it's a continual back and forth that is very interesting. So sometimes the specific issues change, but the tension does kind of remain, that when you have people in these very different environments, they make judgments about one another and what their lives are like, and whether or not they really have anything in common. The other thing that's so tricky is that rural life is not a monolith. So people experience it very differently. People on a hobby farm or on a prosperous farm or on a centennial farm, some of those people who have enjoyed middle-class rural life have a much different experience than our rural residents today who are working in an extractive industry or any kind of agricultural adjacent industry. People who work at a meat processing plant still often live in rural areas. They have a much different experience. And so rural life is not necessarily always synonymous with agriculture. And that is something I think for people who are maybe not as familiar with rural places, that is maybe something that passes them by. When you hear rural, when you think of that, you think of a farm. And our media does a really nice job of emphasizing that. I love those commercials where they're trying to sell you like a processed sausage, and they're showing these two bearded men in flannels in a red barn. That is not how your sausage gets made. But it's the iconography of this idea of what American rural life looks like, and it is a farm. but that is not always the case. And so people who are rural are also working in other industries and have been for more than 100 years at this point. That synonym has not always been true, certainly for part of the 19th century as well.
I have big concerns about the marketing element of that. I was in marketing for years and, marketing the family farm on the cereal box or the milk carton, or that family farm has a machine that's getting those eggs into the carton. Not all the time. It depends on the size of the farm, but the bigger operations are industrialized. So there's sort of two sides to this. There's the reality of what's happening, but also the reality of like our human nature, that we want to see our landscapes dotted with red barns and silos and black and white cows.
Yeah, I am always the most fascinated when products, especially processed products, use farm iconography. There's a very famous salad dressing brand that does this very effectively. And every once in a while, they'll run commercials where people are outside. They're surrounded by fresh vegetables, but they're also kind of like harvesting the dressing. And there's not even any dairy in that product. So it's one of those shelf-stable type things. And so I think that idea of this is where my food must come from, and so it's okay, is a very compelling marketing tactic. And it has been for a long time, this notion that your food is being processed in a small way. It's a more intimate setup than our actual industrialized agriculture for food is. And so it provides people a bit of comfort where they don't have to think too much about it because they're being provided these images of not how things work in real life. And I think, too, that's for people on farms, I'm sure, although I can't speak personally to this now as someone who lives in an urban space, I suspect that's a little frustrating for them as well, to be used as a marketing tool, but also in some ways also disrespected as in like the rubes of the landscape in other times. So hard to be the whiplash victim on that situation.
Yeah. One of the things I was thinking about from reading the chapter that you wrote was again, we're just still in this space of farm life being idealized, where, life on a farm in a rural space, yes, you get to be outside, but the work is endless and really grueling. Farmers in the U.S. typically work long and irregular hours that vary with the season, the type of farming, and the daily tasks. During peak times like planting and harvesting, farmers often work 12 to 16-hour days, starting before sunrise and continuing until dusk or later. In the off-season, hours may be shorter but still involve essential tasks such as equipment maintenance and planning. Livestock farmers have more consistent daily hours due to the ongoing needs of the animals. Weather conditions and emergencies can further extend working hours, making farming a demanding year-round occupation.
Extremely difficult. The physicality of the work, the hours of the work. I think people sometimes, it's hard to wrap your brain around the irregularity of the hours that especially people on farms work. They're physical hazards. It's still a dangerous job for a variety of reasons. Farm accidents, issues with animals, things of that nature. So it's still dangerous, which is a historical truth as well. And increasingly, the lack of services for people who are living in those spaces, so that when you do have an emergency or a problem, you are increasingly far away from medical services. You are farther away from things that people, when you live in an urban space, you start to take, I think, a little bit for granted, that things are quick to get, a quick run to the store, a quick run to get food that you didn't have to fix, a quick run to a doctor or a dentist. Those things don't exist in a lot of parts of rural America. And there was a window of time where they were more available than they are today. There was also a period of time where they were less available. So the hook is kind of swinging back to a time where people were isolated in some ways, maybe not so much because of telecommunications today, but there are some real disadvantages that people living in rural spaces are facing right now that don't seem to have necessarily as many quick and easy answers, I think, as we would like.
I know that there's been an increased conversation around, farming is really hard. The financials are really hard. The system in which these farmers are operating doesn't always allow them to make the money that they, sort of put into making the product, it's hard to get out of that product. And that can lead to a lot of extreme stress, like financially, from a family perspective, had the land in your family, or if you're just leasing it, I mean, just all of it. And that mental health issues pile up and there isn't a whole lot of relief there, or maybe even a combination of the services and the tradition of being able to reach out for help, which isn't, I think, very common among the farming community.
Yeah, that was certainly a key issue in the early 80s with the farm crisis, particularly in parts of the Midwest.
The farm crisis of the 1980s in the United States was a severe economic downturn that deeply affected farmers in rural communities. Triggered by high debt levels from the 1970s, rising interest rates, and plummeting commodity prices, many farmers faced foreclosure and bankruptcy as land values fell and borrowing costs soared. This financial instability led to widespread mental health issues, including a high rate of suicides among farmers, and caused significant social and economic distress in rural areas. The crisis prompted political activism and policy reforms, accelerating the consolidation of farms and leaving a lasting impact on American agriculture and rural life.
Rates of foreclosures really skyrocketed, and issues relating to mental health and longevity on the farm have been highlighted recently. There have been a couple of new books, but some of the pieces that were put in place then are still around. So things like Farm Aid, there are a couple of hotlines that people can call when they are feeling dire.
I interviewed Farm Aid not too long ago, and I will put a link to that episode in the show notes for you to listen to.
But I think there is this bit of continuity where farmers are inherently entrepreneurs. You're running your own business. Sometimes it's a smaller business, sometimes it's a slightly bigger business. But there are these kind of socioeconomic expectations for people who are business owners that farmers sometimes cannot meet the metrics for. The expectation is that that kind of lands you in the middle class, and that provides some kind of financial stability, maybe some retirement, some of these things. But when all of your assets are tied up in the land and the land is the business, you can't really liquidate that for cash. You can mortgage it, but there's not a lot of liquidity there to have flexibility in your business the way that potentially other business owners have. And that issue of whether or not people on farms are in the middle class or not has been one that came up in the late 1800s as the standard of living for other people got better. It wasn't always getting better for people who lived on farms and in rural areas. And so that's been a discussion point that kind of comes back around. You're doing all this work, putting in all this effort, you're trying to have essentially a business that, possibly kids can inherit and you can pass on and will provide for your family. And that should be a middle class occupation, but the pay is not always something that puts people in the middle class. And so that's a very difficult reckoning, I think, in terms of the quality of life that those producers should have versus the actual income that they get out of those businesses.
I think that it's going back to my question, it connects to this, is something that you mentioned in your book about the sort of the beginning of support services from the government for rural areas, like when that started and how that's going.
Yeah, it's funny. It's kind of riddled with pitfalls. So it's a classic urban to rural divide where in some ways, rural people were already advocating for themselves. They were forming organizations, cooperatives. They were working together, even politically in some places, to be their own advocates as the experts on what they needed. And there was especially during the Theodore Roosevelt administration, this idea that there definitely could be some potentially sort of government help involved, and with very good intentions, but they used the expertise of people who did not live in rural areas anymore, who were not on the farm anymore. They called academics. Essentially, they called the early 1900s equivalent of me and said, hey, what do these people need? What would make their lives better? And so academics, again, with great intentions, went out to study the problem and figure out what they thought these people needed. And, at times it's always just better to ask the people you're trying to help directly instead of, kind of creating a solution from on top and then delivering it to the recipients. It's often better to work collaboratively with your recipients to figure that answer out. But they came up with lots of different ideas about, whether they could help people create cooperative businesses, a co-op dairy, or they tried out things like cooperative kitchens and laundries and things that they thought might make people's workload easier. They tried in some ways to fix rural schools by extending the school year, providing ways that maybe rural people could socialize during the peak of their busy season. They threw a lot of things at the wall to see what would stick, and some of it did stick. Some of the school improvements and some of the public health outreach that they did during that time was also very effective. There was a pretty clear divide between things like infant and maternal mortality in certain rural spaces compared to urban counterparts by the early 1900s. And so they sent out nurses and doctors and traveling wagons with things that would help you put screens on your windows and keep your kitchen a little more sanitary. And so some of those things were really effective. They did actually help people. So quests like that have existed for a considerable amount of time at this point. And sometimes they sort of cycle back around. A new slate of programs will come out, and there will be some that are intended to specifically benefit rural people. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. But it is often, the sort of policy experts that are assembling those packages as opposed to the people who are the targets for the programs. And of course, rural people are not the only ones who end up with that kind of being the targets or recipients of things that they didn't get consulted about. But there's definitely some historic precedent for trying to do those things.
Can you give me an example of one that missed?
One of the things that missed in the early 1900s was some of the cooperative production that they tried to launch. They built these beautiful designs and blueprints for like a community dairy processing facility that would do things like butter and cheese. And so you would bring all your stuff there and it would get processed together. But farmers had, in many cases, invested in their own equipment and in their own stuff. And so they had already specialized and they had already made the investment. And so hauling those things to a cooperative center to do that work, it kind of negated their investment. It also negated some of the expertise of their own wives and daughters who did the dairy processing. So while I know many of us are used to getting dairy products through those huge conglomerates today, there was some pushback there in certain communities about, we're not interested in you building this new thing in town and we'll all bring our stuff there because we like the way it's set up. We feel like this is working for us at this moment. And so rural people did pick and choose which of those things they were going to consume and be recipients of and which ones they weren't.
What's the deal with this whole farmer's wife label? I don't understand it at all. And there's a new, the farmer's wife, isn't she a farmer? Why are we doing this?
It's very strange. My preference is always to let people identify the way they want to identify. And so some women on farms want to be identified as a farmer and some do not. And so that is okay. Historically, they have been labeled as keeping house, even though they are working their tails off and they have specialized skills. I was listening to someone talk last week at the Rural Women's Studies Association about whether women on farms identified as feminists and what a sort of loaded term that was for them.
The Rural Women's Studies Association, RWSA, is an international organization based in the United States that focuses on the history, culture, and the experiences of rural women. It aims to advance the understanding of rural women's lives through research, education, and outreach. This association includes not only historians, but also female farmers and others involved in rural industries. They host conferences every couple years to present research, share knowledge, and network, and to promote the publication of scholarly works on rural women's studies.
They were very proud of the work they were doing on farms and ranches, but some of them were uncomfortable with that particular terminology. But then there was also somebody who was telling a little anecdote about a man who had a farm, but he couldn't live on it because he didn't have a wife. Because the work that women do and did on farms is so critical to the success of that operation that, you'll have women on farms without men sometimes, but you very rarely have a man on a farm without a woman. So historically, especially in the mid 1800s, there were women who homesteaded and claimed land on their own, sometimes with sisters. So you could have an all women homestead. You did not very often have an all male one, because there was just something about the set of skills that women brought to the table that seems to perhaps be a little broader in terms of what they were capable of doing, both in the house, in the garden, with animals, and on the land. And so some women are comfortable being a farmer's wife, and I'm perfectly cool with that. And to me, as a historian, it's very strange, this new homesteading movement, this kind of like back to the land thing where, what are we calling it now? It's like a trad wife, where women are on these like small farms and they're baking bread and things. And that's lovely for them if they want that. But I think it's very interesting that people don't realize, like, when you actually are on a farm and you are farming and also keeping a house and have a family, you're working like two full-time jobs at once. So traditionally, or the trad wife, historically speaking, is someone who is constantly at work. In the 1920s and 30s, there was a survey done about the number of hours a week that farm women worked. So the men's hours came down during the winter time, like the slag time. They're still working, but it shaved about 20 hours a week off of a man's work in the wintertime. It did not shave any time off the wives. They were working on average 80 hours a week, just steadily and constantly. That's two full-time jobs. And so this idea that traditionally women don't work, just because they're not getting a specific paycheck in their name doesn't mean they weren't working. They were working just hellaciously hard all of the time. And without that work, the farm doesn't work. The kids are not there. The house isn't getting, none of the things that make the farm are actually happening. The processing, the marketing, sometimes driving to town to pick up a new part for a machine and bringing it back. That was her job. And so that idea of like that women stayed home, I'm like, well, that doesn't really apply necessarily to rural women at all, because they're at home, but the home is the job. And they are bringing in money and resources, and what they do has dire financial consequences for their families. And so I'm fascinated by this sort of notion that, you get on a like 5-acre plot of land and buy some chickens, and all of a sudden you're not working, and that's traditional. Cause I'm like, oh goodness, no, there's nothing traditional about that. Like, it's cool for you. I don't want to knock it, but it's not traditional. And that is not historically how women in those settings have worked.
I actually really like your perspective. If someone wants to be called a farmer's wife, then that's fine. You're right.
Yeah. Who am I to say how you define your work or your life or any of those things?
Right. At the same time, I think the recognition around the farmer's wife, it sounds so gentle.
It does.
We all know it's not.
And it certainly undercuts the financial contribution that you are making to the operation that is your family's business and livelihood. And I also think in some cases, if you're talking about things like long-term financial security, some of those farm wives also have jobs off the farm so that that household has health insurance, and so that somebody has a 401k that isn't the land. So things like that. So some women are still, in fact, farm wives, but they may also be a nurse in town or a school secretary. Especially during the 70s and 80s, a lot of women on farms picked up an outside job because their families could not sustain themselves on the land with just the land as the income. And so that's a long-running issue. Again, historically, other farm women, especially throughout the South, women of color had to take outside jobs as a way to stay on any kind of land. And so it's not unheard of or rare, but it's important. It's an important part of the contribution that those women are making to their families.
I've had a lot of conversations with farmers, big and small, about, the USDA, for example, like from subsidies that aren't going in the right direction, but there's really no other choice, to different kinds of management and decision making that isn't consulting farmers. I was on a podcast about the protests in the UK, and I think it's a similar situation across the pond, where the government wants to have lower emissions in general across all kinds of industry, including agriculture, and want to say what those numbers will be by a certain date in a certain way without involving anyone in a conversation. And you end up with, tractors burning manure on highways and that kind of thing. So I'm just curious to hear your perspective on those kinds of things.
I think it's an issue, especially right now. You follow the money to the power, and that's where influence is held. So right now, there are entities that are steering farm policy, like the Farm Bill. Those entities are not just farmers and family farms. Those are agribusiness, huge corporations that have an enormous amount of power and reach in our government. And so they are steering policy toward what is most beneficial for them. And that is not necessarily the best policy for our sort of smaller producers or mid-sized producers in particular, who we would identify as sort of family farmers. And so when you follow that power stream and you follow their money and influence, you are ending up with policy that helps, billion-dollar corporations and not family farms that are hoping to bring in enough to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table for the next year. And one of the things that farmers did historically, especially in the 1890s, that was remarkably successful in the short term, at least, was formed their own kind of political action group, essentially. They had their own political party for a while. And it was not necessarily successful at the federal level the way they wanted it to be, but it was remarkably successful at their state and local levels, and it had enormous national influence overall. Now, of course, this is a time where more people were farmers. It was a larger percentage of the population, but there's still a lot of political power in rural areas because of the way that we have our sort of federal system set up. And so I think that to be heard and listened to in this particular atmosphere is about money and power, and sometimes making yourselves heard over that. So whether it's, in the 1890s, they were mad about interest rates and railroad monopolies and things that were affecting their bottom dollar. So you can change the metrics on those and that part will change, but it's still things that are affecting their bottom dollar and making it hard for them to have a livelihood the way and to be good stewards of the land. I think small and mid-sized farmers who have connections to their land and farm, they have its best interests at heart if they can manage it. If it's financially feasible for them to take good care of it, they will. It's similar to if we need them to produce different things for people's health and well-being, they will do it if they can make a living doing it. It's just hard to be heard in this environment of huge money talks in a huge voice. And that's a very difficult situation to be in, I think, right now.
So what do we do?
I do not know. I think consumers have a lot of power with their dollar. I know our dollars don't feel very powerful right now, but we've been talking about why things are so expensive. And farmers are not seeing that money. Your milk went up by $2 or $3 a gallon. Your dairy farmer did not get that money. The handlers got it. The marketing department got it. Everyone else took a piece of that because they thought they could. And they saw an opportunity to raise prices, not because inflation was driving them in that direction. They took an inch of rope and ran a mile with it. And so people can be responsible with their spending sometimes and support people at farmers markets, get more involved in understanding where your food comes from and what the environmental impact of different types of agriculture can be. Those things are important. They're going to be important for all of us, whether we live in rural areas or not. And so if you can talk with your dollars a little bit as a consumer, even off the farm, I think that's important. And it provides important support to those people and not be dismissive. I'm from the Midwest, so I'm used to that kind of that flyover business that we get into. But those people deserve the same amount of respect as everyone who's working on the coast and vice versa, obviously. And so not discounting the work that people in those spaces are doing and the economic impact they have, the environmental impact they have that can affect all of us. I think that's an important kind of way to connect people. If you have issues that are important to you, you may find that some of them have an agricultural or rural connection. And so sometimes finding that common ground isn't as hard as we think it is when we start talking about, water and air and food and things that people share in common no matter where they live. Those are important connections to make.
I think no matter who I talk to, big or small, a teeny farm, just across the board, what to do is it's a small action. It's something that you can do every day that's easy to do. It's shopping locally or finding your farmer's market, listening to someone's story instead of imposing your own narrative on it. And I think just taking those small actions, it has such a big impact.
I live in a place where the grocery store that I get to shop at does, in fact, try to source things locally and within the state. People can put pressure on their grocery stores to do the same. You can pay attention to farm workers and their activism. They deserve a living wage just like everyone else does. And it's not going to really make your tomatoes much more expensive because they're not seeing the increase in price that you're paying anyway. So things like that can have a real impact on rural places, rural economies and spaces, and make things better truly for everybody. People are not aware of things like farm worker activism in rural areas today.
Farm worker activism in rural areas of the United States encompasses a historical and ongoing struggle to improve the rights and conditions of agricultural workers. Beginning in the early 20th century and gaining momentum in the 1960s and 70s, movements led by figures like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta have focused on securing fair wages, better working conditions, and protections under labor laws. Key efforts include the formation of unions like the United Farm Workers, UFW, which negotiate for worker rights and advocate for legislative reforms at local, state, and federal levels. Despite challenges such as opposition from agricultural employers, legal obstacles, and the transient nature of the workforce, farm worker activism continues to address issues of social justice, healthcare access, and immigration reform, adapting to modern challenges like climate impacts and changing labor practices.
It's people just trying to take care of their families like everyone else and like farmers are. So there's lots of ways to get involved or at least pay attention.
I'm always a little bit baffled by we've got to feed the world. Do we? Do we have to do it this way? Is this the only way? We have to feed the world because why? It's not something we actually have to do. And we can provide a lot of food and keep it here and export it in a way that isn't like overproducing.
Yeah, it's so tough because that phrase, like we feed the world has been, I think, weaponized a little bit to make it hard to criticize agricultural production in the United States. I want people to starve because I don't like that slogan, which of course I don't. But there's this issue about what we produce and what it gets used for that I think it gets in the trenches a little bit. But, we way overproduce certain things that we do not actually consume. And so we put it into gas tanks and we put it into corn syrup and we export and dump it on other economies by the just bushel loads. And so we produce way more of some things than we need and not enough things that sometimes we do. And so our self-sufficiency of, we have to be able to feed ourselves first is, I am all for that. But some balance in that would be lovely. And just kind of stepping back and saying, okay, what does this actually look like? Where do these things go? And how much of this do we need? And how much are we paying for that we are not using as food? Those statistics are jarring for people who are not aware of them. We produce all of this corn. We are using our most productive farmland to do some of that work. And it sometimes gets dumped in other people's countries as an export. It gets put into ethanol that is then heavily subsidized. It gets put into other sugar-related products that are also heavily subsidized and then repackaged for consumers in things that are maybe not necessarily as healthy as they could be. And so it's such a complex system. And I think sometimes it's intentionally complex because then it gets confusing and hard to really pin down and you feel like you can't do anything about it. But I think educated consumers would really go a long way to helping. I've long heard farmers say like, hey, if I can get paid to produce, carrots or whatever it's going to be, I'll do it. They're producing what they're getting paid to produce. And so until that system changes a little bit, I think that's sort of where we are. And that's unfortunate to some extent. I think we are losing an opportunity to innovate and do interesting things with the land that I know some people have started doing, interesting new cover crops and just different types of fodder and feed and different ways of doing some of the animal husbandry. Every time I hear about a new one, I light up with joy because people are out there trying within the system that they're in to do good things. And I know that doesn't apply to everybody, but I'm an enthusiastic supporter when people take on that task because it's no easy thing to be the outlier in your community of doing something different.
Anything, thoughts, burning issues that we didn't cover that you'd like to leave us with?
I'm really excited for your listeners to know that agricultural history is a thing and that the history of rural life is a thing, and that all of these pieces have a history. And that history is important. It's important to the history of the United States. It's important to the history of people on farms and ranches, farm workers, people who work in rural industry. They are not invisible, especially not for historians. We see them and are trying to connect those pieces all of the time. So it's been delightful to get to talk to you, because you're thinking about things that are sometimes invisible, and we are also working in a space that sometimes seems invisible. So it's nice to be able to, I guess, kind of demonstrate that lots of different histories have lots of different relevance to today, and they kind of inform things. And so it's nice to be able to get that word out a little bit.
Thank you for joining me today on this really interesting journey through the hidden stories of rural life in America. I hope that Megan's insights have covered new connections and given you a deeper appreciation for the challenges and contributions of rural communities. Remember, every action you take, whether it's supporting local farmers or understanding where your food comes from, or simply listening to the stories of those who grow and produce your food, can drive significant change. Stay tuned for more episodes of One Bite is Everything, where we continue to transform complex topics into clear, actionable understanding. From food to awareness to action and impact. Tune in to OBI. One Bite is Everything, and be part of the movement. If you'd like to take a meaningful action right now, you can go into the podcast app where you're listening to this and give it 5 stars. Maybe even write a short review that will take you just a minute or two, so that other people might be able to find this podcast as well. And if it's easier for you, go ahead and share it with a friend right from the podcast app. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time, right here on One Bite is Everything.